In the late 19th century, the United States still liked to think of itself as a different kind of country from the old European empires. It was a republic that had once fought a war of independence against Britain, and for most of the century its expansion had been continental, across North America. Yet in 1898, in the space of a few months, the United States fought a short war with a fading European power, destroyed its fleets, took control of distant islands in the Caribbean and Pacific, and emerged from the conflict with colonies and protectorates of its own. The Spanish-American War turned a continental republic into a global empire and raised uncomfortable questions about what the United States really stood for. By the 1890s, Spain's empire was a shadow of what it had been. Most of Latin America had gained independence earlier in the century, leaving Madrid with only a few scattered possessions: Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific. Cuba was the most valuable of these remnants. Its sugar and tobacco plantations generated enormous wealth, and American investors were deeply involved in the island's economy, owning plantations, railways, and businesses tied to Cuban exports. At the same time, Cuban revolutionaries had repeatedly risen up against Spanish rule, demanding independence and a more modern, less oppressive political system. In 1895, a new Cuban War of Independence broke out. Spanish authorities responded harshly. Under General Valeriano Weyler, Spain implemented reconcentration policies, forcing rural civilians into camps so they could not support the rebels with food, shelter, or information. Disease and hunger spread rapidly in these overcrowded camps, and tens of thousands of Cubans died. Across the water in the United States, these reports of suffering appeared in the growing popular press. Newspapers printed shocking stories and images of starving civilians and brutal Spanish officers. Some of the reporting was accurate, some exaggerated, but together it created a powerful sense that Spain was committing atrocities and that Americans had a moral interest in the fate of Cuba. This was the age of mass circulation newspapers and fierce competition for readers. Powerful publishers such as William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer discovered that stories of Cuban heroism, Spanish cruelty, and looming war sold papers. Their sensational style of reporting, later nicknamed yellow journalism, used bold headlines, dramatic illustrations, and emotional language. Although foreign policy decisions were still made by the president and Congress, this wave of public outrage made it politically easier for advocates of intervention to argue that the United States should act both to protect its investments and to defend liberty just off its shores. Inside the United States, opinion was divided. Business interests worried about instability in Cuba and the impact on trade. Humanitarian activists were appalled by the reconcentration camps. Strategists influenced by the naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that the United States needed overseas bases, coaling stations, and a strong navy if it wanted to be a great power. On the other side, some Americans still feared foreign entanglements and did not want war. President William McKinley, a veteran of the Civil War, was cautious. He preferred negotiation with Spain and hoped that pressure might persuade Madrid to reform its policies in Cuba and possibly grant greater autonomy. The crisis changed dramatically in early 1898. To protect American citizens and interests in Havana during the unrest, the McKinley administration sent the battleship USS Maine to the Cuban capital in January. The ship anchored in Havana harbor as a visible symbol of U.S. concern. On the night of the 15th of February 1898, a sudden and massive explosion tore through the Maine, sinking the ship and killing more than 260 American sailors. The true cause of the explosion has remained controversial ever since. Later investigations suggested an internal accident was possible, but in the emotional atmosphere of 1898, many Americans immediately believed that Spain was to blame. Newspapers rushed to print huge headlines accusing Spain of treachery. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry. The deaths of the sailors transformed a distant colonial struggle into a personal insult in the minds of many Americans. Public pressure on McKinley intensified, and in Congress interventionists found it much easier to demand action, while the president still tried to find a diplomatic way out. The sense that honor and national pride were at stake made compromise harder. Ultimately, diplomacy failed. In April 1898, After a series of exchanges and failed proposals, McKinley asked Congress for authority to use force in Cuba. Congress passed a joint resolution recognizing Cuban independence and calling for Spain to withdraw. At the insistence of anti-imperialists, the resolution included the Teller Amendment, which pledged that the United States would not annex Cuba, but would leave control of the island to its people once peace was restored. Spain rejected the American demands, and in late April, both countries formally declared that a state of war existed between them. Although public attention focused on Cuba, American strategists were already thinking globally. Spain still possessed a major naval squadron based in the Philippines, and the islands themselves were home to another independence movement. At the outbreak of war, the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, was ordered to find and defeat the Spanish fleet in the Pacific. On the 1st of May, 1898, Dewey's ships steamed into Manila Bay at dawn. In a few hours of fighting, the American squadron destroyed or disabled the Spanish Pacific Fleet with minimal U.S. casualties. The victory at Manila Bay shocked observers and effectively ended Spanish naval power in the Western Pacific. On the ground in the Philippines, events moved quickly. Filipino revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been in exile, returned and revived the struggle against Spanish rule. Filipino forces took control of much of the countryside and surrounded Manila. For the moment, Americans and Filipino nationalists were allies against a common enemy. But their goals were not the same. Aguinaldo and his followers expected that victory over Spain would lead to Philippine independence. Many American leaders, however, were beginning to see the islands as a strategic prize, a gateway to Asian markets and a key naval base in the Pacific. In the Caribbean, the main theater in the American public imagination, war unfolded just as dramatically. U.S. troops began landing in Cuba in June 1898. Among them were regular army units and volunteer regiments, including the famous Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt, then a politically ambitious former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Black American regiments, often overlooked in popular memory, played a crucial role in the fighting. The key land battles took place near the city of Santiago de Cuba, where Spanish forces held strong defensive positions on the heights. On the 1st of July, 1898, American forces attacked the fortified hills around Santiago, including Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. The assault was difficult and costly. Soldiers climbed steep, exposed slopes under Spanish fire and intense heat. Nevertheless, after heavy fighting and disorganized but determined charges, U.S. troops captured the heights. This success put Santiago at risk from American artillery and squeezed the Spanish position. At sea, the decisive blow fell soon afterwards. The Spanish Caribbean fleet, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera, was trapped in Santiago's harbor by the blockading U.S. Navy. On the 3rd of July, Cervera attempted to dash out along the coast in a desperate bid to reach open water. American warships were ready. In a running battle, they sank or drove ashore every Spanish vessel. The destruction of Cervera's squadron eliminated Spain's naval presence in the Caribbean. Without a fleet to protect or resupply its garrisons, Spain's position in Cuba became untenable. Meanwhile, U.S. forces moved into Puerto Rico with relatively little resistance, taking control of another Spanish colony. By mid-August 1898, it was clear that Spain could not win. The two sides agreed to a protocol of peace that ended major fighting while diplomats negotiated the final terms. The resulting Treaty of Paris was signed on the 10th of December 1898. The terms reshaped the map. Spain renounced its claim to Cuba, which was to become independent, at least in theory. Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded outright. To the United States, the Philippines were transferred as well, with the United States agreeing to pay Spain $20 million, framed as compensation for public works and infrastructure. At the same time, during the war, the United States had also annexed Hawaii, adding another key base and future territory in the Pacific. With one short war, the United States found itself in possession of, or in control over, a string of islands and peoples, far from its mainland borders. In Cuba, the United States did not formally annex the island but occupied it and oversaw the creation of a new government. The Platt Amendment, later written into the Cuban Constitution, gave Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and guaranteed the U.S. a naval base at Guantanamo Bay, effectively making Cuba a protectorate. In Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii, the American presence was more direct and lasting. As these territories came under U.S. sovereignty, the most dramatic and troubling consequences came in the Philippines. Filipino revolutionaries had expected independence after Spain's defeat. Instead, it quickly became clear that the United States intended to keep control of the islands. Tensions grew between former allies, and in 1899 the Philippine-American War broke out as Filipino forces resisted American rule. The conflict was long, brutal, and far bloodier than the brief campaign against Spain, involving guerrilla warfare, harsh counterinsurgency tactics, and civilian suffering. It exposed the contradiction between American ideals of liberty and the reality of governing subject peoples without their consent. At home, the war and the new empire triggered intense debate. Expansionists like Theodore Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge argued that the United States had a duty to bring order, progress, and civilization to its new possessions. They believed that great powers needed colonies, strategic bases, and a strong navy to protect trade and project influence. In their view, 1898 was simply the moment when the United States stepped into the role it was destined to play on the world stage. Opponents of imperial expansion saw things differently. The Anti-Imperialist League, which included prominent figures such as writer Mark Twain and industrialist Andrew Carnegie, argued that ruling foreign populations without their consent betrayed the principles of the American Revolution. They asked how a republic founded on the idea that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed could justify annexing territories whose inhabitants had never been asked what they wanted. Some critics also feared that empire would drag the United States into endless foreign conflicts and corrupt its politics at home. Yet despite the criticism, the basic imperial structure created after 1898 endured. Puerto Rico and Guam remained U.S. territories into the 21st century. The legacy of American rule is still felt in the Philippines and in the U.S.-Cuban relationship, not least through the continued presence at Guantanamo Bay. In strategic terms, the war confirmed that the United States was now a global naval and colonial power, with interests and obligations that stretched across oceans. It also established patterns of intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean that would continue in the decades that followed. The Spanish-American War was often described at the time as a splendid little war because of its short duration and relatively low American casualties compared to later conflicts, but its consequences were enormous. It ended Spain's old empire in the Americas and much of the Pacific, pushed the United States into the ranks of imperial powers, and forced Americans to confront a new question. Could their country remain a democracy at home while exercising imperial power abroad? The answer has never been simple, and many of the debates that began in 1898 about empire, morality, security, and markets are still alive in discussions of U.S. foreign policy today. Sources used: U.S. Department of State, Office of the Historian, The Spanish-American War, 1898, Encyclopedia Britannica, Spanish-American War and Related Entries, History, Com, Spanish-American War, Library of Congress, The World of 1898, The Spanish-American War, Gampadilla, Spanish-American War. Additional standard academic works on U.S. and Spanish colonial history.